We're going to get going, and as other people join, they will hear what's going on. Thanks to everyone for joining this panel discussion, which after several years of what feels to me like constant Zooming, I hope will still be an interesting discussion on Fortress Europe and the Syrian refugee crisis. My name is Slemrod. I'm Middle East editor at the New Humanitarian. For those of you who don't know, we're an independent nonprofit newsroom that focuses on humanitarian crises and the people impacted by them. Part of our mission is to inform prevention and response to these crises, and that includes taking a magnifying glass to the aid industry. We've got lots to cover this evening, so I'll be brief. As the description of the event mentions, 10 years into the Syrian war, there are more than 6 million Syrian refugees, and nearly 7 million people have been forced to flee their homes but remain inside the country, what people in the aid business call internally displaced people. Syria is no longer in the daily headlines, but as a humanitarian journalist, it is, however, on my desk, and I would guess many of your desks every day. The war is not over, the economy is collapsing. When it rains heavily or snows, as it recently did, children die in tents in northern Syria or in Lebanon. People are still trying desperately to get to Europe, where they are met with what is often called Fortress Europe. Poland is currently building an even higher fence than it already has, topped with razor wire and cameras on its border with Belarus, where thousands of people, including Syrians, have tried to cross, got stuck, and people have died of exposure there. The book this panel is based on, which is titled Everybody's War, The Politics of Aid in the Syrian Crisis, edited by Médecins Sans Frontières, including when we have one of the editors, as Michiel is a panelist today, is wide-ranging and looks at, and I'm going to quote here, ways in which humanitarian aid, advocacy, and health service delivery have sometimes been complicit in a war that placed the provision, diversion, and restriction of services at the center of the battle for the Syrian state. I'm guessing many of you are involved or interested in the aid industry yourselves, so this probably brings something different to mind for everyone. For me, the first thing that I thought of was 2016, when aid trucks entered Madaya at the exact same time that they entered Fua and Kafraya. It was the only way that warring parties could agree to help something like 40,000 people inside one of the towns get help, who were reportedly by that time eating spiced leaves. It was carefully choreographed, and this is just one instance of what I've been calling convoy theater in this war, where we've seen a lot of rhetoric about the tragedy of what's happened to Syrians, and often less action than many people would like. Then again, and perhaps our panelists will be able to speak to this, it would be hard to find a conflict where aid groups have not been forced into some really difficult decisions. Some logistical notes before we get started. I'm going to put some questions to our panelists, and after they either speak to me or each other, we'll have a full at least 30 minutes for questions from the audience. You can put them in the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will direct them to the right person. It will help if you say who you want your question to go to. So let's get going. Professor Don Chatty. Professor Chatty is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Oxford and former Director of the Refugee Studies Center, which is graciously hosting this event. Don, while many people think of the Syrian refugee crisis as a European problem, most of the people who have fled Syria actually have remained in the region. And your chapter of the book looks at how Syria's neighbors, namely Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, handled a massive influx of Syrian refugees and the different approaches they took, in part depending on their histories. What's your take on how they have handled this over the years? Don, I think you might need to unmute.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, I did. Thanks a lot. You always forget that, don't you? Yes, what I've tried to articulate in this chapter and in a lot of my writings in the last 3 or 4 years is that in order to understand the region, you really have to understand its recent history and the context and the former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, the Levant, the Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and also, parts of Iraq. So up till about 100 years ago, these former provinces, in these provinces, movement and mobility was encouraged, and it helped to maintain the multicultural, the multi-ethno-religious communities linkages across this vast territory. And it also meant that really important kinship ties, social ties, economic ties, and networks were developed, which I argue many of those have remained today and help explain the way that refugees, displaced Syrians actually moved. So one of the things that I think I'll add to here, I know that there's been a lot of media attention on the discrimination that Syrians are being exposed to in the region in this conflict that's gone on for more than a decade. But I think what we really need to keep in mind is that Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey have been very accommodating. You know, Turkey has the same size population just about as Germany. It's about 83, 84 million. And yet Turkey has nearly, well, depending on which figures you want, somewhere around 4 million displaced Syrians, whereas Germany, which is seen as really the beacon of European humanitarianism, has taken about 1 million. Lebanon has taken 1.1 million, although it's probably a higher figure, and that represents 34% of the population of Lebanon. And Jordan, with a figure of around 600,000, that represents about 10% of the total population of Jordan. So with these large numbers, it's actually not surprising that you can get some negative news stories. So I'll just give you an example. In 2016, we were getting reports from Lebanon that the 40 municipalities in Lebanon had created curfews, you know, from 6 p.m. until morning, so that Syrians weren't allowed to move around at night. But what they forgot to tell us was that there are more than 1,000 municipalities in Lebanon. And even though those numbers have really climbed, especially in the last 2 years, because of COVID and the kind of fear that COVID has instilled in the other, the outsider, many displaced Syrians have been, I'm going to say, targeted as somehow being vectors of COVID in Lebanon. And so about 300 out of the 1,000 municipalities now do have some sort of curfew or ban on the movement of Syrians at night. But we're forgetting about another 700 where they haven't. And when you look a little bit more deeply in the situation in Lebanon, you'll find that it's mainly Christian Maronite communities that have imposed these kind of bans, whereas the Muslim communities in Lebanon have been very forthcoming, very accommodating, and very helpful. So, I mean, this is just an example of these kind of bad news stories, I guess you could put it. So yeah, you know, I think there are some big differences in how Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan have responded to the incoming of large numbers of Syrians. A lot of that is based on their history. And it's a matter of accommodation or of stability, of sort of, I am going to say, muddling along and managing, because only Turkey has actually set up domestic asylum law to create some kind of temporary protection for Syrians. That was put into effect in about 2014. But Syrians in Lebanon and in Jordan, they basically, as I said earlier, they have to rely to a great extent on their kin networks, their previous economic networks, and also the remittances now that they're beginning to receive from those who've managed to get abroad. And surprisingly, in Lebanon in particular, but also in Jordan, there's a surprising growth in the last 3 or 4 years of local NGOs, some of them Lebanese, but many also of middle-class Syrians who are not registered as refugees, really coming out to support displaced Syrians in their countries. So I don't think it's half bad when you consider the huge numbers and you compare that to Europe's attitude and response, particularly the kind of pushback that we've seen particularly from Greece. Greece is now kind of that point of externalization. There's been some really very difficult stories to see that have come out from the way Europe is handling the Syrian displacement crisis.
As I expected, my internet cut out for a second there, but I think I got most of what you said. Thank you, especially for those numbers. It really puts in perspective you know, when we talk about Fortress Europe and the refugee crisis being a European problem, it does put into perspective where most of these people are. But I am a member of the media that you mentioned, and perhaps guilty of some of those bad news stories. At the Humanitarian, we reported on the great lengths that people have gone to get out of Syria, and particularly these days from Idlib. There have been pushbacks. There is regularly people are shot at the Turkish border. Given all this and the fact that Lebanon and Jordan's borders have effectively also been closed for the past few years to Syrians, how welcoming can you really say that these neighboring countries have been?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, this is a crisis that's been going on for 10 years. So you can't deny that the initial welcome was certainly was there. Turkey was particularly accommodating. You know, they set up what the ICG, International Crisis Group, called 5-star camps for 250,000 refugees from Syria. In fact, the camps were so fancy, you know, with paved roads and electricity and functioning bathrooms and kitchens and laundromats, et cetera, that UNHCR kind of mocked these camps as being too expensive and something that the Turkish wouldn't be able to maintain. But the borders were open. They were, you know, Lebanese border was open. And you have to consider that of that 1.1 million Syrians who came into Lebanon, it wasn't the first time that they'd come, because at least 500,000 Syrians regularly came into Lebanon in the previous decades as seasonal workers in agriculture and in construction. And so many basically just brought their families over. So that welcoming, initially borders were open. It was for our Arab brothers, et cetera, and yes, in the ensuing period, because this crisis has continued, and especially after 2016, when so many of, I'm going to call the professional middle-class Syrians who had wanted to stay and try and rebuild the country, basically gave up with the, first of all, the near takeover of the entire country by ISIS, number one, and then the Russian bombardment, aerial bombardment. Many of them just at that point gave up. So yes, Turkey has done some, they've also returned people, some of them not across the border, but certainly they've picked up Syrians who are, for example, in the major cities, whose registration cards indicate that they registered somewhere else. You've got the Rukban camp that's really near a Tanf on the Syrian-Jordanian border that was set up in 2014. And originally there was a little bit of effort, at least to get water and smuggle food in. But then there was a huge ISIS strike in 2016, and the Jordanians said, cut it. We know that there are ISIS people there. We're not letting you people in. So there are a lot of different reasons. I mean, even the Idlib, the closing of the Turkish border recently is part and parcel of the way in which the Syrian Assad's regime, with all of their sort of negotiations of allowing the opposition fighters, some of them very radical, to go to Idlib in exchange for other people coming out, you've ended up with a province that probably had about 1.5 million people originally, civilians, but another 1.5 million of radical opposition that nobody wants to see float out across the border. So that border has just been cut by Turkey. And I will say, not surprising. I mean, some of Turkey's responses have seemed really extreme, but you have to also consider that there have been times when Turkey has been saying, we can't take any more. We need Western help. Help us set up safe enclaves in the border area. And when that hasn't been accepted, they shut the border, or else they open up their border to Greece to say, okay, then let people leave, as they did in, I think it was February 2020. So yes, you know, I can't deny that there have been many examples of borders being shut, but a lot of them you have to look at the context of why has that happened, and why is nobody else sort of coming in to try to unlock the impasse that's kind of created. So I would still say, compared to Europe, and the kind of prevarication that's emerged around the EU-Turkey contract, where EU really hasn't paid the 6 billion that they're meant to pay. They haven't lived up to their, I think it's called a 1.1 mechanism, where for every Syrian sent back from Europe who didn't qualify as a refugee, they're supposed to take a Syrian in Turkey into Europe. And I think they were meant to take around 70,000, but that mechanism, even over the last 5 years, they've only reached about 15,000. So yeah, I think Turkey can say that the EU really hasn't done its part of the bargain. Yeah, I still say that there are a lot of problems. I don't know how much longer you want me to carry on, but I think one of the big issues in the region is that Western humanitarian agencies are still very focused on local integration and providing aid for the very poorest, those who are under the whatever poverty line is established. So it's emergency food, it's cash transfer and so on. But there are many skilled workers, professionals, Syrian doctors, nurses, lawyers, teachers, engineers, IT specialists, quite a few, who need to be able to move on. They realize that all they can do is just survive in the region. But to move on, to find ways of building sustainable income somewhere else, even temporarily, until such a time as they can return. And they're not able to. And I would say that's partially because of the way the Western humanitarian aid has been put forward. So, I would still call for some kind of comprehensive plan of action if we could, if we really wanted to move forward and solve what seems to be such an intractable problem now.
Thank you. I think Reem has her hand up, so she might like to jump in. Let me first give a short introduction. Reem Musa is Humanitarian Advisor on Forced Migration at MSF, where she focuses on the humanitarian impact of displacement, asylum, and migration policies. And she is joining us from Melbourne, I believe, where it is extremely early in the morning or extremely late, depending on your perspective. So Reem, I think you had your hand up. If that means you wanted to jump in, go ahead.
Thanks, Annie. And thank you, Dawn, for that introduction to this very complicated topic. Just, kind of reinforcing some of the points that Dawn already raised is that the reality of international displacement, and you mentioned when you opened the discussion that, this is beyond a European crisis. And I think we have to always keep in mind that this never was a European crisis. And the fact that there was a refugee crisis in Europe is part of the instrumentalization of crisis language that reinforces Fortress Europe itself. So I think it's very important that we move away from those discourses as they reinforce the militarization of European borders. But we know that international displacement, not just in relation to the Syrian crisis, but everywhere, most people do move to their neighboring countries, and it is neighboring countries that end up having the majority of the hosting responsibility or capacity placed on them. And this was the same in the context of the Syrian crisis, obviously to a much larger scale, because we haven't seen this kind of mass displacement to this scale in a very long time. However, I think what's really concerning, not just in relation to Syrians, but in terms of global displacement, is the extended period of temporality that people are forced to exist in, and the extended state of precarious status that people are forced to exist in, whether in a neighboring country or now what we see more within when they move on to third countries, like within the European territory, where they're kind of suspended in these periods of irregularity and undocumentedness. And I think that's what, for me, is very clear in relation to the situation of Syrian refugees and others in Turkey, is that the extent of which their reception is allowed is in the form of the temporary protection, right? And so that limits future aspirations, that limits how far people can go in building a life for themselves. And in the context of where we have, a refugee displacement crisis that, is been the past 10 years, and, we don't know how much longer, not only is it unacceptable to allow this period of temporality to go on forever, but it also shows the disregard of, other countries and declaring these countries, third safe countries, which is an essential part of the EU-Turkey deal, to allow then that permanent temporality to be kind of the new baseline, the new accepted standard for international protection. And so when we go back, as Dawn already touched on, the idea of solutions or durable solutions, which are around integration, resettlement, or going home, now we don't have any of those, really. What we have is, permanent temporality, which is very concerning, either in these kind of countries where you exist as a guest, or in third countries where you're likely to become undocumented, right? So this is the kind of pattern that we're seeing, not just for the Syrian crisis, but in terms of global displacement more broadly. I also want to touch on some of the terminology that Dom used around, the idea of terrorists, but also the idea of economic migration, right? And I think these two terms and the idea of the refugee and all these terminologies have been kind of conflated and stigmatized in different ways in relation to Fortress Europe. And, I don't think people have multiple aspirations and overlapping titles. And I think to try to separate those things is somewhat of a fallacy. But the idea that Syrians or people coming from a non-European country cannot have economic aspirations as part of their displacement, and that being stigmatized and a justification for therefore their deportation and return, is also one of the key justifications that we see in relation to Fortress Europe, and one that I think is very important to challenge, because as Dawn already highlighted, those two things are very intertwined.
Thanks. Michiel, I'm going to try to bring you in here because, well, first let me introduce you actually. Michiel Hofman has years of experience with MSF in so many places that I can't list them all, but a few are Liberia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Kosovo. These days, he's a senior humanitarian specialist for MSF, and he is editor of the book we are here to discuss today, and I believe has a copy available if somebody wants to see what it looks like. There you go. So speaking of what both Dawn and Reem brought up, which are these spaces where people are sort of in, they're stuck. And there's a part of the book which discusses Idlib, but also the concept of endless siege. So not just actual sieges like the ones I mentioned in my introduction that have been a hallmark of the war, but also I believe you would argue that, or it's been argued in the book, that there are other ways that the war has contained people, including inside Syria and outside Syria in places like Libya, for example. Could you tell us a bit about more of that? With my cat joining us.
Yes, no, indeed, because we still see the consequences today of these different policies, which is both political choices and military tactics inside the country, but also political choices and humanitarian choices outside the country in neighboring countries, and further afield, mostly related to migration to Europe. And that reverberates until today, which you would see leaves large populations in a state of limbo, or as Reem said, permanent, temporarily, sorry, I'm just tripping over the word, but you know what I'm referring to. Because as you said, besiegement as a military strategy really came back with a vengeance in the Syrian conflict. I think the last time we've seen it to that extent was in the Bosnian conflict a few decades earlier, and that is obviously a military tactic, an extreme example of preventing people to flee conflict as a military strategy, which was in the end, after the Russians entered the conflict and kind of tipped the balance on the military side, very rapidly reversed with the Syrian authorities regaining control over those besieged territories. But part of that process was this reconciliation agreements. In practice, people that have followed the war would still visualize, probably in their mind's eye, these pictures of hundreds of green buses being lined up outside the besieged areas after they were taken by the Syrian army, which essentially was part of the deal that populations could choose to either stay and be integrated back in government-controlled area, or have the option to be shipped to areas that were still under opposition control, which in practice meant the northern territories in and around Idlib up to the Turkish border. So as a result, in an area which normally would be a few million people, there's now anywhere between 1 and 2 million displaced that all have been shipped in those green buses over the course of 2017, 2018, and some into 2019. which is, of course, the actual opposition fighters and their family, but also political activists and other people that would fear prosecution if they would have stayed in these now government-controlled areas. So now you have a massive concentration of displaced in an area that is actually unsuited for that. There is not enough host families, so you now have these massive makeshift camps in and around the border with Turkey, and Turkey effectively having closed their border since 2015. So no options for these people to move on, and they are in this state of limbo. With one of the reasons given why these people can't move on is because there will be former fighters amongst the population. So essentially saying to the whole population, because some of you have a military past, none of you can move on. And that is a direct consequence of the immediate besiegements inside the country. But then if you look a bit further outside of the country, then indeed, as Dawn highlighted, in the first years of the war, 2012 up to 2014, 2015, the three neighboring countries, disregarding a bit Iraq here as a neighboring country, have taken in quite large numbers of refugees, and quite freely in the beginning. But by 2014, 2015, in all three countries that started to reverse, where Turkey closed their borders for refugees in 2015, as did Jordan, and from 2014 onwards, Lebanon made it increasingly difficult for refugees to have an official status in the country. Instructed UNHCR, the refugee agency from the United Nations, to stop registering refugees, and essentially only allowing people with pre-existing family connections to still enter the country and seek refuge there. So that is quite early into the conflict. Options for people to leave the country have diminished to close to zero, and that is before the most violent period of the conflict was still to happen. Russia entered the military coalition of the Syrian government, already aligned with Iran and to a lesser extent Hezbollah in 2015. And all the big stories, the fall of Aleppo, the fall of East Ghouta, and all of these extremely violent periods, the takeover of large parts of the country by Islamic State, were still to happen the moment these borders were closed. So unsurprisingly, we're now in a situation that, yes, there's by now 6 million refugees outside the country, but an estimated 7 million that are stuck inside the country, and that also led to some of the most extreme examples of populations in sometimes literally in no man's land. Dawn already refer to the refugees or displaced. It's what to call them, because they're actually in between the two borders, between Jordan and Syria, in which is the no man's land, originally in the Rukban and Hadalat border crossing in Rukban. These people are still there, and they're literally stuck in no man's land since 2015. And again, with the justification that amongst those populations, and let's also be clear, this is not just 35-year-old men, these are families with children and people that are obviously not fighters, but nevertheless they can't go back, they can't go on, and they're stuck at this border. Another extreme example of this type of thinking, of using the security argument to contain entire populations, for me is the still existing, well, let's call it a refugee camp, but it is actually a refugee detention center of Al-Hol in the Kurdish controlled areas of Syria. So these are indeed families and children of Islamic State fighters, but also populations in general that were kind of stuck in the last remaining areas under Islamic State control in 2016 and 2017. And this is a refugee camp or displaced camp that is a closed camp, and nobody wants those people. People cannot move on within Syria. People cannot move outside of Syria. A lot of them have their statehood revoked. And again, a reminder, these are not just hardened fighters. These are families, small children, literally stuck in no man's land. So these there are consequences to the realpolitik that I can understand, that Don has highlighted, of the absorption capacity of neighboring countries, security concerns, but as an end result, some smaller and larger populations are stuck in a perpetual limbo with no way forward and no way backward and no agency anymore in choosing their own fate. And this is an ongoing situation. And then finally, of course, the last layer of siege, if you like, that is highlighted in this chapter is indeed Fortress Europe. That refugees that did manage to make it out of the country and want the opportunity to move on, also because the countries themselves, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, would say we have limits to our capacity. Can other countries please also take some responsibility? So after this wave of Syrian refugees that was allowed mostly to Germany and Sweden, if you look to the proportion of the population, with the rest of Europe barely scratching the surface in terms of taking in Syrian refugees. The borders with Europe have remained firmly closed, mostly because of domestic policies and the popularity of anti-immigrant policies to get elected, is my impression. And that persists till today as well. Most infamously, of course, the so-called EU-Turkey deal, which was already referred to, which for MSF anyway in 2016 was the reason that that we will no longer accept any kind of humanitarian funding either from the European Union or European Union member states for the disagreement for using humanitarian assistance as a means to essentially purchase border closure in Turkey, and that refusal to take these funds remains in place today. But the policies haven't changed. So refugees, whether from Syria or now from Afghanistan or from Somalia or from Iran, that continue to try to reach safe havens in Europe, continue to be deterred in a very brutal way, as we see now play out from those that managed to go to Erbil, take a plane to Minsk, and move their way to the Lithuanian or Polish borders, where you see a very violent pushback of these refugees, and you continue to see that for people that take other routes through North Africa, Libya, and try to cross the Mediterranean, mostly in the direction of Italy, where the Italian authorities do everything in their power, including prosecuting humanitarian agencies like MSF, for essentially the act of saving lives on the Mediterranean. So that siege mentality of Europe and the European Union with regards to refugees on arguments of security, that this might bring in fighters, on arguments of making a differentiation between economic migrants and other types of migrants. I don't know, because everybody has to survive, so there will be an economic desire for every refugee that flees anywhere. And that continues to till today as well. So this policy made, if you like, environment where both inside the country and outside the country displacement and refugees have been used for political purposes reverberates until today.
Thanks, Michiel. I think Don wants to jump in there. Don, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Michiel, for really elaborating on what the fortress in Europe is all about. Because if I take us back to the region, we've talked about these different border closures, but there are no huge fences. And people within the region are using people smugglers to get out. I mean, even in Rukban, you have people smugglers slowly moving people out. So there are no huge walls. There's still a lot of movement. I've seen it taking place between Lebanon and Syria. Turkey in the Kurdish region is not quite as difficult as in the Idlib, which is nearly impossible. So. But what I want to just move towards, but still looking at this region, is that many of the professional Syrians who have skills and so on have been very fearful of being recognized and registered as refugees. Many feel that that kind of recognition precludes their ability ever to return to Syria if this Assad government remains in place. And so what many have sought is the ability to go somewhere else. You could almost call this a form of complementary pathways, but people are doing it on an individual scale. And really, I've seen the growth of numbers after 2015, 2016 of Syrians being allowed entry into Saudi Arabia to work with jobs, to the United Arab Emirates. I mean, in just 4 years, the number of Syrians in the United Arab Emirates jumped from 125,000 to 250,000. So they're there to work. There are about 1 million Syrians working in Saudi. And I'm not saying this is, I'm not going to decree this as something, to be celebrated, because of course, they could be fired at any time. They don't really have any political protection, but they have jobs, they have work, and many of them are using this as a period where they're not quite in the same kind of limbo as when they were in the neighboring countries, because they have employment. And as some of them have said to me in the Emirates, it gives them time to organize their papers and see if they can find a third country to either resettle in or to be able to have the opportunity to work and send remittances back to those who haven't been as fortunate as them, and then wait out the situation until they can return, but with some kind of dignity and safety by being employed. And this is something that we're seeing happening in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia, although I recognize we don't like to give the Gulf and Saudi Arabia credit for doing anything positive in the humanitarian sense, because none of them have signed the 51 Convention. I would say that many of the professional and skilled Syrians, some of them have succeeded. I mean, France is one country that has actually allowed Syrian doctors and nurses to come and work in France without being classified as seeking asylum. And many have sought that because many feel that that's the only way that someday they can go back. Because one of the things that the Assad, I'm going to say the regime, has made very, very clear is anyone who's asked for asylum elsewhere is considered a traitor. So you're either a terrorist because you rose up peacefully to challenge the government, or if you fled across a border, you're a traitor, which makes both impossible for you to return.
Thanks, Dawn. And you certainly have a point that the coverage of the Gulf is in the media is often, let's say, unbalanced. And particularly in the humanitarian community, it's been very interesting as we cover the aid world to see how the Gulf's role has changed. A large influx of money, clearly, from that part of the world. Reem, did you have your hand up, or should I?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, yeah.
Okay.
No, so yeah, just to jump on. There's a lot to say, so I'll try to order my thoughts. But I think on the point of the kind of pathways and the binary between economic migrant and refugee, and what that means, I think it's and Fortress Europe. So coming, Dawn uses the example of Syrians going to the Gulf, but I think also another interesting thing to keep in mind is that the policies of Fortress Europe, so whether they're directed towards Syrians or whether they're directed towards African migrants migrating from through the central Mediterranean, or Afghans and Bengali migrants, are all kind of around a politics of desirability and undesirability and keeping people out. And you see disproportionate amount of resources being invested into preventing the entry of Europe towards a minority of migrants entering Europe, right? So if you look at European migration policy, there's 3 million people coming in and out of Europe every year, right? But then you have a budget of $1 billion going to Frontex to kind of prevent people entering, mainly coming from refugee-producing countries. So you see this kind of juxtaposition. I think for me, it's always interesting to look at the example of another group of migrants that were entering Europe in 2015, which was Ukrainian migrants. So people coming from Ukraine, entering mainly through Poland. And there's estimates that between 1 million to 1.5 million people entered the EU from the Ukraine during this period, right? Although the refugee crisis and then the policies that came along with it were predominantly focused on people coming from the Middle East and Africa. And the difference is that those people coming from Ukraine were actually able to apply for temporary visas, work visas and permits, and were able to enter as economic migrants and never kind of went through the process of having to apply for refugee and asylum, and were also able to move from Poland to other countries in the Schengen zone for work reasons. And so you see that there was a very different approach taken at the same time towards a large movement of people coming from Ukraine versus those coming from the Middle East and Africa. And I think this is something that is also very important to take into consideration, is that many people migrating around the world, as I said, have these joint aspirations of safety, but also financial aspirations, because part of safety is that, and those things have been stigmatized for those that are coming from the Middle East and Africa, and are used as justifications for their deportation and detention at the European external border.
Thanks, Reem. Michiel, you have your yellow hand up.
Yeah, just one other thing I would like to highlight, also, but in response to one of the things that Don has highlighted, that humanitarian organizations were focusing on the poorest, and then not so much on the skilled refugees, but a bit of a reminder that is kind of the point as well of humanitarian assistance, to actually focus on those that are the worst off and the poorest and the least opportunities to find refuge or find means to leave the country or leave the region based on their financial capacity or their skill set. So that in itself, I think, is not something that can be held against humanitarian agencies, because that is what they are for. To look at that, because there was a bit of a cynicism also from European countries at some point promising a lot of financing for refugee populations in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, which was explicitly put forward as a means to make sure that people didn't leave those places. And then there would be very small groups of people that would be interviewed on the spot in different places, whether or not they could apply for asylum. And then often it was indeed judged on how useful that refugee or refugee family would be in Europe, and that links then to rhetoric that is very often used in the political sphere in many European countries, that people that are crossing the Mediterranean or crossing in small boats to Lesbos and other islands in Greece are jumping the queue. But that's kind of presupposes that there is a queue to start with. And in most cases, there is no other option because large parts of the refugee population are already excluded from applying for asylum where they are, because they don't fit the profile of what European countries see as useful for their particular country.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, Reem, I'd like to, maybe I can bring you in on this. I know since you have a more global focus, you touched on this earlier, but I mean, we talk about Fortress Europe in reference to the Syrian crisis. And, there have been walls put up. I know, Don, you mentioned some people are getting out, but certainly in Turkey, there's a massive border wall in the north. that was put up in response to this crisis. But you know, how much of the way that we talk about refugees, how much of the concept of Fortress Europe is really about Syria, and how much existed before?
Yeah, I think the idea of restrictive migration policies and Fortress Europe, but also Fortress Australia, Fortress America, Fortress, you know, is one that's been emerging very well from the, I guess, late 90s, early 2000s onwards. And we know very famously that there was always bilateral agreements with places like Italy and Morocco to stem migration from North Africa and particularly sub-Saharan migration into Europe. So, and also the idea of migration deals and trading people for various reasons is also not unique to this kind of century. However, I think what's important about the Syria crisis, or the moment of 2015 and the so-called migration crisis that was constructed in that way, is it really reinforces the ways in which crisis can be instrumentalized to embed and to further fortify the fortress of Europe, right? And I think what the 2015 moment allowed was basically a reinforcement of policy ideas that were already there or half there, and really kind of a consolidation of that. And really the EU-Turkey deal really signifies the blueprint of what we see now as being kind of repeated both in other bilateral deals that are being written at this moment, such as the 2017 Italy Libya deal, and also the deal between Spain and Morocco, but also not just the bilateral deals, but also the elements around the containment policies in the hotspots, the allowance for zones of exception that we're seeing, that was experimented in Hungary, and now that we're seeing replicated in the Belarusian border with Poland and Lithuania, claiming border zones and detention sites in those countries as zones of non-entry. And so, you know, where you can suspend EU law and kind of allow a prolongation of procedures in those places. So what I think is interesting is that there's always been some element of fortressing militarization that has been increasing over the past 25 years. But really, I think the EU-Turkey deal and the policies that were brought in as exceptional measures at the time of the crisis, and the ways in which crisis has been instrumentalized, is a tactic that the Commission has been using and EU member states have been using to keep introducing new policies and allowing an expansion, of a rapid expansion of Fortress Europe. And we see this as, for example, the EU-Turkey deal and the idea that Turkey was a safe country really only applied to Syrians. And now, only last year, we know that the Greek government introduced a new joint ministerial direction, which expands that to applying to Afghanis, Bangladeshis, Somalis, Pakistanis, which are the main countries of people arriving in Greece, right? We also know that the hotspot that were constructed as the site for mass deportations, essentially, and containment. We all talked about the bad living conditions in Moria for a long time. Now what they're being replaced by are basically prisons on the Greek islands in a very much highly securitized, highly barbed wire, very difficult to access places that will now be the new processing site. So what we're seeing is what was an exception is now really the blueprint, and that rapid increase of these policies have been justified and through the language of crisis and exception over the past 5 years, and we'll continue to see that as we're seeing in Belarus and Poland right now.
Thanks very much. A reminder to everyone who is watching or listening that you can put questions in the chat, and I will put them to the panelists shortly. Michiel, I'd like to bring you in on this. The book discusses humanitarian complicity in a range of things, but I'm curious when we talk about these hotspots, about working in places where that require ethical compromises. I don't know what's your take, especially since you've worked in the humanitarian world for so long in so many different contexts, on the ethical and moral dilemmas that humanitarians have faced in working in the Syrian refugee crisis in places perhaps now like Al-Hol or in the hotspots. There's certainly an argument that working in these places that has been made anyway, that working, for example, in detention centers in Libya accepts that they should exist. What's your take on that?
Yeah, because the book indeed explores, that's one of the main themes, to see how much or how little the actual humanitarian politics actually helped or hindered the conflict and the consequences in many aspects, and not just in relation to the refugees and displacement. And in most cases, the complicity is more in a passive sense. For instance. When it comes to besieged areas, there's one chapter in the book that looks at the business of war, where it's very obvious that a lot of businessmen were making big profits out of the war economy of a besieged area. So, and a lot of this war economy was around humanitarian agencies trying to bring in resources in those besieged areas. So then you can argue that this humanitarian assistance actually prolongs the besiegements, which may or may not be true, but that's an obvious one, and that is kind of a dilemma that you see in all humanitarian action in conflict. It just gets exacerbated in an extreme situation like besiegement, where it becomes much more obvious. And another one is clearly the perpetual the dilemma of when you see an unacceptable situation like refugees being detained, indeed, like you say, like is the case inside Syria in Al-Hol, that will soon be the case on Lesbos and other islands in Greece, with these now processing centers becoming de facto detention centers, the Libyan detention centers, which are even just called detention centers. They're not shy about it there, and whether or not humanitarian agencies, including MSF, working there to give some healthcare, essentially provides the infrastructure for these centers to function. And this dilemma that you have, so either you don't do it and people start dying of trivial diseases, and so the choice in most cases is that you do it. But with that comes the obligation, I think, to very loudly keep on pointing out what is wrong with those places and why these circumstances don't need to and should not exist. And here the book also touches on part of the complicity, which I do think is not a passive complicity, but it's more an active complicity. And when it comes to the situation in the neighboring countries, and how both the access for humanitarian agencies to bring aid inside Syria, or with regards to the flagrant disregard of refugee conventions in many cases when it comes to policies implemented in Jordan and in Lebanon, and to a lesser extent in Turkey, that at the same time these were countries that humanitarian agencies, and I include MSF firmly in this list of agencies, the countries that they needed in order to actually run their programs in Syria, because all of them were cross-border, either from Jordan, from Lebanon, or from Turkey, or in the case of Turkey, it still is cross-border from Turkey. And here I think MSF and others have remained relatively silent for fear of losing access to those countries, and therefore access to continue their aid programs inside Syria. So here I would argue that when it comes to what happened in the Rukban and Hadalat no man's land situation in Jordan, what most people call the Berm, what happened with regards to refugee rights in Lebanon, some of the transgressions from the Turkish authorities. Yes, they were 5-star camps in terms of infrastructure, but they were certainly not 5-star when it came to people's rights and freedom of movement. And here I think the humanitarian agencies, including MSF, were too silent to kind of offset a bit this complicity for working in those places. And that is valid for the issue of displacement and refugees, but certainly also for a lot of other transgressions that happened during the Syrian conflict, which were not as strongly addressed, and I include in that also al-Hol. People vaguely know about the situation, but mostly through the lens of what is called the ISIS brides that have been their nationalities taken away, but not as an actual population, which includes women and children that are kind of locked inside a camp with minimal assistance and with nowhere to go. And here, MSF and others, I think, should have been more vocal in highlighting the plight of these people.
Thanks, Michiel. At the New Humanitarian, it's certainly been, I feel like sometimes we're swimming against the stream when we report on al-Hol and try to point out that the population there were both victims of and supporters of ISIS, and that it's, that's a complicated, of course, I'm sure it's complicated for European countries, but as well as for the aid agencies working there. Reem, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just to add to Michiel, I think none of us can deny that in relation to the EU-Turkey deal, that humanitarian aid and assistance and agencies that worked with that assistance, it was directly kind of used as part of the bargaining chips, right? So I think that's such an obvious example in terms of the way humanitarian assistance or humanitarian rhetoric can reinforce the ideas of Fortress Europe. However, at the same time, thinking more about the hotspots and situation at sea in the Mediterranean and other places, I think in relation to like migration detention policies and all of these kinds of things, we have to also remember that part of the restriction is also, it's a deterrence policy ultimately as well. And part of the deterrence is to make these conditions and these and these journeys as difficult as possible, and the conditions to be as horrid as possible. And so in a way, if civil society or humanitarian organizations or anyone, activists or anyone, are able to kind of mitigate that horribleness that is trying to be constructed, it's also a way of challenging the system, right? And challenging the objective of deterrence. And so, one thing for us, a lot of our dilemmas in working in the European context is around, okay, you're working in this high income country, they have the resource to provide healthcare, they have the resource for doctors to provide basic medications and all these things. But I think what we have to remind ourselves as humanitarian organizations is that they're not providing those things on purpose, right? So there's an absence of services as part of the structural violence as well. And so it's also it's maybe, depending on how you position yourself, right, it's playing a bit of a different role in terms of, in a different relationship in terms of how we perceive our work in other places, and the nature of the structural violence in terms of relation to Europe, of Fortress Europe is a bit different. I think we see this a lot in the search and rescue setting, where actively European countries have abandoned the search and rescue space. They've pulled away their coast guards, they've placed Libyan coast guard there as a way to basically making the sea crossing more dangerous, and also allowing people to be more likely returned to Libya as through the Libyan Coast Guard doing intersections. And if NGOs, if humanitarian actors left that space widely open and all retreated because we don't want to be part of the border zone or the border, then actually that's feeding into the objectives of Fortress Europe as well. So, humanitarianism, like every pursuit, is not a purist pursuit, and it is work that is filled with dilemmas, and they're dilemmas that we have to negotiate and try to find where the best interest of the people we're trying to serve sits.
I've got some questions from the audience that maybe I'll just work in as we're here. I think, Reem, this would be an interesting one for you, since you were just talking about the EU-Turkey deal. This question says, do you think the EU-Turkey deal should be stopped, considering its suspension or the fact that much of it has not been implemented, uncertainties, and the EU's unfulfilled promises? And if anybody, other panelists, wants to jump in on it, please do.
So I think you have to come back to what is actually the EU-Turkey deal, right? And, you know, some people say, oh, the EU-Turkey deal is maybe a good thing because part of it is $6 billion of assistance, right, to Turkey to be able to host to refugees. But I think the EU-Turkey deal, as planned, as envisioned, is a deal that is primarily aims to decrease the number of people arriving in Europe and allow opportunities for deportation into Turkey. So if in that logic, then the EU-Turkey deal is a very problematic one, is not a humanitarian deal and should be suspended. However, coming back to Dawn's initial point, which there does need to be comprehensive solutions, there does need to be solutions that look at protection, that looks at complementary pathways, that look at solutions for people who want to remain close to home, all of those kinds of things, then yes, those kinds of structures need to be negotiated. And that might be between Europe and Turkey in one stage, right? But if the deal's primary logic is around limiting the number of arrivals to Europe, it's not a deal that's about humanitarian assistance and protection in the first place.
Yeah, so indeed, in short, yes, it should be stopped because it's an aberration. Humanitarian aid should be based on needs only and not conditional to people closing borders or to stop moving. That's the short answer.
Can I come in here and
Dawn?
just say,
yes,
yeah,
please.
I mean, if we're looking at the EU-Turkey deal, I think we should also look at these various global compacts, the Global Compact on Refugees and on Migrants. Really, we're only supporting what I'm going to call Fortress Europe. It was just further, it's not even soft law, further agreements that basically were meant to make sure that people didn't try to come to Europe. So we have both of those compacts. We also have the Jordan Compact, the Lebanon Compact, and all these were about, let's see if we can somehow find a way of getting Jordan to keep Syrians there, to keep Syrians in Lebanon. Basically, I'm going to say agreements that didn't really address neither the aspirations nor the concerns of Syrians. Because I mean, like with the Jordan Compact, basically it opened up employment in the garment industry, in the economic zones, and perhaps a few more formal work permits in the agricultural and the construction sector. But as I said earlier, you have so many skilled workers and professionals who have, in order to survive, have ended up having to do this kind of work. And meanwhile, it's a kind of rentier economy. Jordan gets paid for this effort in order to give more displaced Syrians work permits, but only in these particular sectors, while you have so many skilled professionals who are just unable to do anything. I really think, I mean, we've only touched on it, and I realize we're going away from the basis of this book, which brings out some really, really important points. But, you know, I don't understand. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but, you know, I think about Sergio de Mello's 15 years that he spent working on getting a comprehensive plan of action in effect for the Vietnamese boat people. 15 years it took, but eventually he got countries all over the world to accept 1 million Vietnamese boat people distributed everywhere. There were 40,000 that went to Canada. And I think they even celebrate the Vietnamese presence in Canada. A certain number then were negotiated with each state where large numbers existed to remain, and if not integrate, at least to be locally accommodated. And then a certain number who wanted to go back to Vietnam, provided with the opportunity to go back in safety, so that Vietnamese states basically said, we're not going to prosecute these people. I don't know, maybe there is somebody out there trying to negotiate something like that, but right now it seems to me that no, there's not. You've got all of these states in the Arab world, except for Turkey, who have never signed the 51 Convention, nor the 67 Protocol. I mean, Turkey has, but it's only restricted to Europeans. And then you've got all these European states who have signed the 51 Convention and the 67 Protocol, and are now talking about trying to, I mean, look at the Home Office with Priti Patel talking about how, well, you know, we're going to make anybody who arrives here a criminal if they didn't actually come officially. But the only way to come officially to the UK right now, if you're Syrian, is through Zaatari refugee camp or Azraq camp. There are 2 or 3 camps in Jordan which you know, you may be able to enter the UK from. And these are camps which are outdoor prisons. You're not allowed to leave these camps. Just to go on to Michiel, at least the camps in Turkey were always open. You could leave in the morning, you could come back in the evening. Everybody knew that you were working in the informal market because the informal market is so huge in Turkey, in Syria, and Lebanon, and Jordan, and so on. So I don't know the solution. I mean, again, it's a political solution, because as long as you have, populist politicians in Europe scaremongering about the impact of allowing too many others into the country, you're going to have people voting for them, and then you're not going to have a change of policy, and you won't move in the direction that I think we really do need to move into in the next decade.
As far as I know, refugee resettlement numbers are historically low, or they have been in the last few years. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine, at least at this point, that there really is a global will for this type of thing. Reem, maybe you can speak to this question.
Yeah, I agree with Dawn. Mainly, I think we're in agreement there. I think what it represents, and I think the fact that you have to renegotiate the global compacts, is how far away we are from the Geneva Convention right now. And I think that the tendency of countries today is to read the Geneva Convention in the most restrictive way possible, to kind of de-responsibilize themselves as much as possible, right? And I think that's a very problematic trend. And as I said in the beginning, what it's led to is large millions and millions of refugees. We had the highest number of global displacement ever in history, yet many of those people live in this permanent temporality that we talked about earlier in neighboring countries. So I think sometimes when we're talking about the big things that we want to ask for, which is complementary pathways or more permanent status for people, access to healthcare, education in countries in which free movement in countries, these are seen as kind of big requests or big asks. However, many of those things were implemented before, and I think the example of Vietnamese boat people is a very critical one. But even just 20 years ago, refugee resettlement numbers were much higher than they are today, as we know. So as Michiel touched on as well earlier, the idea that then people are kind of criminalized or further punished for jumping a queue that never existed, and is kind of reducing all the time at the same time is a fallacy, and will result in more people taking more dangerous journeys and living in a more irregular, undocumented way.
Thank you. I think this is probably a question for Michiel and Reem, whoever wants to jump in.
Well, maybe first of all, just to highlight that this is not just a European issue. The most extreme example globally of such an approach really comes from Australia, that infamously came up with this idea of outsourcing this to tiny islands in the Pacific, which were then de facto prisons because they were in the middle of the sea, nowhere. So that Manus Island, which is now being disbanded but still existing, is Nauru Island, and these were just open air prisons in a sense, where people would have no options whatsoever to go forward or backwards, and became and still are places of extreme desperation as a result. Just before MSF was kicked out of Nauru for the reasons of speaking out about the situation, it is a place where we've recorded the most extreme suicide rate, for instance, that we've ever seen, which is an indication of how desperate these populations are. So that's on another side of the planet, and it's not by accident that you refer to the policies in the United Kingdom, that the current Home Office is now actually using this idea of outsourcing processing of refugees, which is modeled after this Australian model. It's just that the UK does it without actually consulting the countries concerned. So they talk about Albania and Ghana without asking Albania or Ghana if they're willing to do that. But that is all part of the same deterrence strategy, which, as we know, in the last 10 years has been very extreme also in the United Kingdom. I think when the large groups of refugees from Syria came in 2015, 2016, with Germany taking 1 million, Sweden taking 200,000. I think eventually the UK agreed to take 8,000 over 5 years, which for me was, you might as well say zero then. But that was less than Iceland accepted. And Iceland is a country of less than 400,000 people. So for the UK specifically, this extreme deterrence, and they certainly inspired by the extreme deterrence policies used by Australia, have been a matter, of course, for quite some time now.
Thanks very much. I know that you have a lot to say on discourse and rhetoric around the refugee crisis, if we want to call it that, and Fortress Europe.
Yeah, I think Michiel already touched on this a little bit, so I'm gonna kind of repeat what he said, but I think particularly post-war and terror, like in this time, I think we know the ways in which counterterrorism, securitization, anti-migration, all of these things have been kind of laid upon each other to justify and frame certain populations as violent, undesirable, disposable, and those things. And I think potentially in relation to, as Dawn said, those immediate border closures with Jordan, and discussing how after the strikes that happened in 2017, the border closure happened, and it was justified because of the threat of terrorism. But we also know that further afield, the justification for border closures in Europe, even within the Schengen zone, were happened after the terrorist attacks in Paris and Belgium, right? And so there's this close tie between using counterterrorism rhetoric to justify increased securitization at borders and targeting of certain populations. And I think also with the Syrian crisis in particular, I think you saw this evolution. In the early stages of the crisis, there was also a welcoming spirit in Europe. And I think part of this, and I remember reading in the news at the time, there's a lot of articles about Syrian doctors and middle-class Syrians and, coming into Europe, and how potentially that's a good thing for Europe. And I think as we saw potentially a more diverse group of people from more regional areas, lower middle income people as that second wave, because it's always, that's what happens. The people who have more means are usually sometimes the first to leave, and then after a while you get other groups from that country, and I think you saw the rhetoric shift, right? And also you never saw a similar welcoming or a similar narrative of good migrants or good refugee applied to Africa, that people coming from sub-Saharan Africa in the same way, right? So I think that the idea that notions of terrorism and of also class are intertwined into these policies is it's very there and present and undeniable, definitely.
To play devil's advocate, a bit, I'm wondering, if from the perspective of these European countries, they believe they have probably legitimate security concerns and feel that they can't absorb any more people. How would you come back to that?
Well, I think that as I mentioned earlier, right, when we're looking at the broader European migration policy, we know that there's a disproportionate amount of resources applied in the control and containment of a very small number of people. Last year, only 4,000 people entered Greece by sea, right? At the same time, we know that at least, according to the Aegean boat report, that at least 900 pushbacks occurred at sea, right? So in terms of the military capacity, securitization capacity, the resources to contain them in hotspots at Greece, I think there's no dispute that there's a disproportionate amount of European migration investment, but also interest in terms of the kind of political prioritization of this subgroup of migrants is disproportionate extremely to the number of people actually coming into Europe. So just from a migration policy, I want to be like effective policy person, it's it's not even a balanced migration policy that we have today in Europe, because you have a disproportionate of resources going into.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. Actually, do you want to start with that one, and if you wanted to comment on what Reem was saying? So if you wanted to just come back on what Reem was saying, because you had your hand up, that's cool too.
Yeah, well, I think in a way I can put them both together, because
perfect.
Because Reem made me think back again on the 700 or 800 children who are in the Al Sinaa camp near Al Hol, who are stateless. Many of them, their parents were from Europe and from North America and Canada. And maybe we can start small by trying to recommend to Europe that as they have signed the treaty on the reduction of statelessness, and they've signed the 51 Convention, that they need to work to think about how to clear out and bring back at least these children, because this is the next generation that ISIS keeps talking about as, what do they call them? Cubs of the Caliphate. They're at an age when you can bring them back to the countries of origin in Europe and in North America, and if not re-educate, at least try to remove some of the brainwashing that they have endured. But somehow I would think that for Europe to allow so many, not just women, basically women and children. I mean, there are a few states that have taken back their citizens rather than strip them of citizenship and leave them there. And I think if we start small and get some sort of cooperation regarding these really unfortunate people, we might be a step in some kind of coordinated action to deal with the entire crisis in Syria.
Thanks, Michiel. Do you want to take on this question? Recommendations for the EU, but you're muted, which might mean you don't.
Well, I would not be so generous as to say, if you just take care of these 700 kids, then you're on the right track. I really think the European Union as a whole is going down a rabbit hole, which will be very difficult to get out of if in the future they still want to be a relevant and credible political entity on the world stage. So essentially for me, it's still like, okay, you actually start remembering what treaties you signed up to and what obligations under international law you sign up to, and which you actually still don't shy away from lecturing other countries like Bangladesh with regard to the Rohingya refugee crisis, or Kenya with regard to the Somalia refugee crisis. So for me, it still starts with abandoning the EU-Turkey deal, which I already called an aberration that shouldn't exist, and that just goes against everything the European Union claims to abide by. International humanitarian law for starters, and all the refugee conventions they abide by. So to actually start resisting these internal political pressures, and it's a narrative which is partly created by themselves, by creating this whole idea of the bad refugee, the economic migrant, which actually sounds a bit like a chancer, that these are people that are otherwise fine, but they're just giving it a shot. This whole idea that if anybody in your vicinity at any stage in their life is being called a terrorist, then you must be a security threat. And a narrative has been constructed over the last 20 years, and I think mostly for domestic electoral benefits, that unless they start rowing back on that and starting to portray refugees in a more positive sense, these are people that are fleeing real conflict, real poverty, and in fact, in most cases that studies show over and over again are actually contributing to your precious economy, not detracting from it. I would like to hear more from Germany, that has absorbed 1 million plus Syrian refugees. The country didn't collapse. the economy didn't collapse. By now, a lot of them have made a success story of their presence there. And unless you start pushing that narrative and stop being afraid of your electorate, and start abiding by treaties that you say to the rest of the world are important, I think the EU and the individual member states will become a force of irrelevance.
Thanks very much. Reem, did you want to take a swing at that one?
I agree with Michiel, but yeah, I think they can reinvest all the money that they're wasting on border securitization into actually a proper dignified reception system and implement fair asylum procedures. And I think they need to look at how to increasing legal and safe pathways to Europe, and that's not just for refugees, but all types of migrants coming from Africa and the Middle East into Europe. So I think that that $1 billion that they just invested in Frontex, I think, can be better used on reception.
Fair enough. Maybe Michiel, this one's for you, or for Reem, whoever, or John, whoever wants to speak to this one.
Yeah, I think
Reem, you're up.
Yeah, so I think the humanitarian community is a big community, right? So I think it depends what you're asking about, but I think there's definitely a lot of organizations, activist organizations, humanitarian organizations, including MSF, that have been documenting and challenging pushbacks at borders, particularly in the Balkans, but also at sea as well. For example, Border Violence Monitoring Network has a black book of over 10,000 testimonies of people that have been pushed back at the Balkan borders since 2016 till 2020. And during that same period, MSF has documented at least over 900 pushbacks that include physical injuries and psychological injuries, which are similar, that demonstrate a systematic nature of violence. I think one of the problems in terms of accountability is that accountability comes with legal mechanisms oftentimes, and it's a little bit of a chicken and egg where in which you have states being the perpetrators of that violence. And unfortunately, border violence still does not fit into the realm of international law at this time, and maybe is something for the jurist amongst us to think about how to challenge. However, there has been some recent, I guess I use the word positive very timidly, but there have been recent developments at the European Court. Late last year, there was a decision on a case of a 9-year-old girl that died, sorry, a 6-year-old girl that died at the Serbian-Croatian border after a pushback from Croatia, in which she was hit by a train after the Croatian police told her and her family to walk along the train tracks in the middle of the night. So this young girl called Medina unfortunately died as a result of that pushback. And the European Court has recently made a decision against Croatia on the case of Medina, in which they have, in a way, said that the pushback was was what had resulted in her death, and they have clearly made a decision against the Croatian government. So that's encouraging, because that's one of the first clear cases which challenge pushbacks at the European Court level. However, the Commission is introducing things like monitoring mechanisms under the new PAC. However, it's very important that we challenge those things because those monitoring mechanisms are not comprehensive and often do not include the sites where these pushbacks actually occur. So the idea of these monitoring mechanisms, which will probably be a parallel system to existing mechanisms such as ombuds people that already exist, and there's a recorded history of harassment of ombuds people that have stood up against pushbacks. For example, the Croatian ombudswoman has received death threats for trying to hold the Croatian police responsible for pushbacks. So in terms of why is there no accountability or not enough accountability, it's a little bit about asking the perpetrator to hold themselves accountable for the violence in which they commit, which is a very difficult thing, as we know. I also think the fact that border violence is still something that is, other than, of course, we know reform wants is something clearly recognized in international law, but there's not really a system to hold states accountable, and the courts, they're slow to act. So, but there is many people in the community that both commend the work of organizations like Border Violence Monitoring Network that are challenging these practices.
Thanks for pointing out places that people can look up what's going on. Don, you have your hand up. We have just a few more minutes, so I think you'll be our last panelist today.
I'll just make it very quick, very short, and actually in support of what Reem was saying. I think if there's any hope, hope lies with civil society, because this is what you're talking about. And what occurs to me was, I think it was a couple of months ago, a number of boats arrived, dinghies arrived on the British coast, and the Home Office became very upset at the people who rushed out with blankets and coffees and thermoses to try to help them, and tried to say that they were engaging in criminal acts. And then the Royal, I think it was the Royal National Lifeboat Society or institution came out and said, no, this is, our job is actually to save people at sea. And there was a huge civil society response supporting them. Apparently they said the donations to the RNLI just shot up after they came back and actually challenged the Home Office, what they were trying to say. This is civil society, stepping forward and saying, what you're doing, what our government is doing is not right. And I think the more that we can encourage that kind of activity, the better. I'm not saying that, we have to become anarchists or anything in that sense, but I think, the future lies with civil society, and particularly the younger generation.
Thanks very much. At the New Humanitarian, we certainly see, we try not to, I guess, differentiate necessarily between civil society and bigger aid groups, or, this is a big discourse in the aid world right now, is localization. And that, we find that often the first responders, the people who know best how to help, are the people who live there, who are already there, and who speak the language. But of course, the question is empowering them, giving them the money, giving them what they need to actually do their work. It looks like we're out of time. Thanks everyone for their questions. That's my alarm going off. We really appreciate them. Thank you to all the panelists, and hopefully we'll see you again.